I'm a high school history teacher, and last time I discussed the historical context behind the setting of Red Dead Redemption 2 in 1899. I reviewed the western expansion of the United States, the terrible treatment of Native Americans, and the rise of American imperialism with the Spanish-American War and the Philippine-American War. If you haven't seen that video, go check it out. In Red Dead 2, Arthur Morgan and the Vanderlyn gang survived the winter and have now set up camp near the small town of Valentine. In this video, we'll dive into the realities of daily life in the US in 1899, exploring the area around Valentine and discussing the little details along the way. Please let me know if I miss anything, and without further ado, let's get right into it. Now that we survived the winter, our first priority is to get some food, so I head down into Valentine to buy a rifle. This catalog in the general store reminds me of old Sears catalogs, so let's start there. Richard Warren Sears was born in 1863 in Stewartville, Minnesota. While working as a railroad agent in the 1880s, he started a business selling watches by mail order. After he met Alva Curtis Roebuck, the two moved to Chicago and started a new company called Sears, Roebuck & Co. At first they focused on selling mail-order watches and jewelry, but soon they started diversifying their stock, selling everything from food and clothing to bicycles, automobiles, and home appliances. Prior to this, most ordinary people bought all their goods and supplies from the local general store, whose owner would charge differently based on the perceived reliability of the customer. Sears changed the game by offering a huge selection of goods at standardized prices. Sears, Roebuck & Co. remained a mail-order business until its first department store opened in 1925 in Chicago. Opening up the catalog, I see an advertisement for food. You will no longer have to store food in a hole, it says. Preserving food in the era before refrigerators, aka most of human history, was always a challenge. In cold, snowy regions, people could bury their food in snow to preserve it during the winter. Underground food storage was common across all regions, since the temperature underground was cooler and more stable. If you lived in a warmer climate, you could salt your food, drawing out any moisture to help it last longer. Other options include pickling food by soaking it in vinegar or fermenting it in the case of fruit and cheese. Drying and smoking meats was also a popular option, and tasty too. In 1802, an American farmer named Thomas Moore invented the icebox, an insulated portable container that could keep food cold. Iceboxes, also known as refrigerators, became common household items by the mid-19th century, and the Sears catalog even featured them for sale. These non-electric refrigerators required a constant supply of ice to fill their insulated middle layer, and thus the ice trade was born. Deep pits were dug in the earth to store ice collected during the winter. Ice could be harvested from anywhere people could find it, streams, lakes, and the ice pits, then transported to ice houses for year-round storage and eventually sold to businesses and customers. The first home electric refrigerators were invented in 1913 and became popular in the 1920s, but it wasn't until after World War II that most homes had them. All this happened after Red Dead 2's time period, so in the game you'll see lots of salted, smoked, and pickled foods. The Sears catalog made grocery shopping much more convenient, but that's just the beginning. Flipping through the pages, I see another advertisement, this time for Wheeler, Rawson & Co. Drugs Department. They sell a variety of supposed cures for different ailments like consumption, known today as tuberculosis, fever, smallpox, stomach aches, pneumonia, and lots of other diseases that plagued people of the 19th century and still today. Microscopic organisms were first discovered way back in 1665, but the modern germ theory of disease was only first proposed in the mid-19th century. By the late 1890s, all sorts of experimental drugs were being concocted in an attempt to treat these ailments, but most failed. On the right, we see the ad lists nerve tonics, liver pills, tinctures of opium, and liniments and salves for women's troubles. Nerve tonics were used to ease pain and anxiety, and one of the most well-known examples was cocaine. Starting in the 1880s, it was used as an anesthetic and treatment for morphine addiction, and by the 1890s it had become popular. The original 1886 recipe for Coca-Cola even included cocaine as an ingredient. In Red Dead 2, you can buy and use cocaine gum, which replenishes your stamina but damages your stamina core. Liver pills like the ones shown in the catalog here were marketed to promote healthy digestion and cure other ailments, but they were later discovered to not have anything to do with the liver at all. Drugs in the 19th century were a gamble. Liquid mercury, which we now know is very toxic, was used to treat syphilis, constipation, the flu, and even melancholy. Some medicines were advertised as a panacea, or cure-all, capable of curing any disease. The most infamous was snake oil. The name originally comes from the oil of Chinese water snakes, used to treat joint pain like an arthritis. Clark Stanley, aka the Rattlesnake King, made his fortune selling snake oil made from rattlesnakes, but he was discovered to be a fraud. In 1917, his snake oil was discovered by federal investigators to contain no actual oil from snakes. Stanley was fined for violating the 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act, a law still in place today that requires drug manufacturers to accurately label the ingredients in their products. Snake oil salesmen thus earned a reputation for being con artists, and today snake oil is synonymous with scams. Back to the catalog again, we can see advertisements for guns and ammunition. In real life, the Sears catalog did really sell guns by mail order. In those days, there were no background checks to own a firearm, and getting one in the 19th century was pretty easy. Lee Harvey Oswald famously shot President Kennedy with a rifle he purchased from a mail-order catalog like this one. The high-profile assassinations of the 1960s led to further gun control efforts, but federal background checks didn't begin until 1998. Gun control remains a divisive political issue in the US today, but seeing the guns and ammunition in Red Dead 2's catalogs is fascinating. Further in the catalog, we see hunting and fishing supplies, horse care and veterinary supplies, and tailor-made clothing. There's even instructions on how to measure yourself. These days, we take for granted the fact that we can buy clothes at our local retailers, but the mass production of clothing at regular sizes is a modern invention. The textile industry was the first to become industrialized, starting in Britain in the late 18th century. Sewing machines led the way in mechanical production, and by the mid-19th century, they were common in family homes. The Sears catalog even sold sewing machines. But as the Industrial Revolution progressed through the 19th century, people increasingly purchased clothing made by machines rather than by hand, especially in urban areas. The real Sears catalog also included instructions for how to take measurements at home so that you'd know the clothes would fit right. Online shopping today is so convenient, the shipping price is calculated for you. But in the Sears catalog, you'd need to look at this handy index of the cost of shipping to every major city in the US. The attention to detail in this little aspect of the game is so impressive. The people at Rockstar really did their homework. It's so easy to overlook the catalog, but if you take a minute to appreciate it, you'll see so many cool little details. Okay, now that we've nerded out about the shopping mechanics, let's get back into the game. I buy the rifle and go hunting with Hosea. We come across a legendary grizzly bear, and I get lucky enough to take it down, providing a ton of meat and a nice pelt to sell or to wear. In real life, the grizzly bear was hunted nearly to extinction in North America. Nowadays, you can hunt grizzly bears legally in Alaska, but it's banned in the lower 48 states because they're considered an endangered species. While our gang gets settled near Valentine, we need to make some money, so I get to work doing odd jobs and side quests in the area. Reverend Swanson apparently found something at a train station near a lake, so I head down there to check it out. Along the way, I pass this rock formation, which really reminds me of Teapot Dome, a famous rock formation in Wyoming that in real life was the center of a political scandal in the early 1920s. Did anyone else notice the similarities, or is it just me? It seems like a lot of the locations in Red Dead 2 are based on real areas in the United States. The geography of the region around Valentine looks a lot like the upper Great Plains and the eastern foothills of the Rocky Mountains, and based on these maps made by Redditors, a lot of people agree. As I play and explore more of this massive game, I'll point out any other connections to real-life areas that I notice, but please let me know if I miss anything. Moving on, I finally find the Reverend, drunk as a skunk in the middle of a game of poker. He passes out and I take his seat at the table to finish the game for him. When I'm done playing, the sun is up and the Reverend is losing a fist fight. I beat the guy so badly that a nearby witness had to be silenced. Finally, I find the Reverend on this train bridge, his foot stuck in the tracks. I barely save him in time and Arthur chastises him for his lunacy. In real life, alcoholism was a serious problem in 19th century America. Alcohol was a big part of American life even since the beginning. After the Revolutionary War, the US was in debt and Congress needed funds to pay it off. Alexander Hamilton suggested a tax on whiskey, thinking that this would be the least offensive option, but the farmers of western Pennsylvania disagreed. They had been making whiskey from leftover grains for decades, and it was an extremely popular drink. So in response to the whiskey tax, in 1794, a group of around 600 farmers started a rebellion. President Washington ordered the military to put down the rebellion, which they did pretty easily. The Whiskey Rebellion was one of the most important events of President Washington's time in office because it demonstrated that the new federal government was capable of maintaining peace and stability. Even so, the government found it difficult to collect taxes on whiskey, and they were repealed in the early 19th century during Thomas Jefferson's presidency. By 1830, the average American consumed over 7 gallons of pure alcohol every year, compared to around 2 to 3 gallons today. People drank all day and night, and it was getting out of hand. Reverend Swanson's behavior would not have been out of the ordinary. As the Industrial Revolution changed the American economy, society began changing as well. Reform movements appeared like the abolitionists and suffragettes, but in 1826 the American Temperance Society was formed, the first successful prohibitionist group dedicated to outlawing alcohol. Throughout the 19th century, prohibition became increasingly popular among religious groups and especially women. In an age where women were dependent on the men in their lives for support and security, alcoholism destroyed families. Prohibitionists spread their message in a variety of ways, but one of the most famous was through political cartoons like this one, The Drunkard's Progress. Here we see what would happen to you if you started drinking. First, you're just having a nice time, making some friends, but then you drink yourself into poverty, your friends forsake you, you get desperate and commit some crimes, and it doesn't end well. Supported by large religious organizations like the Methodist Church, the Prohibition movement spread all across the US. In 1851, the first prohibition law was passed in Maine, and several states followed suit. By the 20th century, alcohol was effectively demonized in many sectors of society, though it's worth noting that it remained popular among immigrants and the working class. In Red Dead 2, it's definitely still popular in the town of Valentine as Arthur and Lenny share a drunken night of debauchery.
Oh, what? I don't know.
The Prohibition movement culminated in the 18th Amendment to the Constitution, ratified in 1919, which outlawed the production, transport, and sale of alcohol, though consumption was not illegal. Later that year, the Volstead Act was passed, giving the federal government the authority to enforce the 18th Amendment. National prohibition of alcohol began in 1920, leading to more harm than good as criminal gangs got rich by selling alcohol. Prohibition would be repealed in 1934 with the 21st Amendment, though you can still find some remnants of Prohibition-era laws in some places in the US today. One night back at camp, Arthur and Dutch are discussing what to do with our stolen goods from that train robbery I mentioned in the last episode. Dutch doesn't seem to have a clear plan, but before we can really discuss it, Lenny comes running up to us saying that Mike has been arrested and thrown in jail in the town of Strawberry. Lenny tried to intervene, but he was nearly lynched. The late 19th century was not a great time for African Americans in the South. After the Civil War ended in 1865, a group of Confederate veterans in Tennessee formed the Ku Klux Klan, dedicated to the suppression of newly freed African Americans, or freedmen. The federal government passed the 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution to protect the rights of freedmen, but when federal troops left the South in 1877, states quickly found loopholes to disenfranchise their voters. Poll taxes were implemented to prevent the poorest Southerners from voting, including many African Americans. Literacy tests were also introduced. These tests featured vague and confusing questions like this: draw a line from circle 2 to circle 5 that will pass below circle 2 and above circle 4. Does the correct response look like this or this? It was up to the person administering the tests, and if you missed any of the questions, you'd be disqualified. You could exempt yourself from these literacy tests, but only if your ancestors from before 1867 could vote. On top of poll taxes and literacy tests, in the late 19th century, Southern states started implementing laws that enforced racial segregation. Interracial marriage was forbidden in several states, separate institutions were built for white and colored Americans, and public places were divided too. These laws became known as Jim Crow laws, named after a minstrel show character by the same name, played by white actors wearing blackface. Now, if all this legalized racism wasn't enough, African Americans faced horrific violence at the hands of angry mobs too. Lynching in the South reached its peak in the late 19th century. You may have heard the story of Emmett Till, a young teenage boy who was brutally murdered in 1955 for supposedly whistling at a white woman. His tragic story helped spark the civil rights movements of the 1950s and 60s, but racial violence in the South was well known and had been documented for decades. Ida Bell Wells, an investigative journalist and social activist from the late 19th century, had written and published accounts of lynchings throughout the 1890s. Her most famous work was The Red Record, published in 1895. Here's an excerpt. John Peterson, near Denmark, South Carolina, was suspected of but escaped, went to Columbia, and placed himself under Governor Tillman's protection, declaring that he too could provide an alibi by white witnesses. Governor Tillman gave Peterson up to the mob. He was taken back to Denmark, and the white girl in the case positively declared that he was not the man, but the verdict of the mob was that the crime had been committed and somebody had to hang for it, and if he, Peterson, was not guilty of that, he was of some other crime, and he was hung, and his body riddled with 1,000 bullets. It didn't matter what the truth was. If a black Southerner was accused of a crime, they would pay the price. There are lots more horrific stories like this in the Red Record, but sadly, despite this awareness campaign, nothing was done for decades. In the time period that Red Dead 2 is set in, African Americans face terrible injustices. It makes complete sense why Lenny is so terrified in this scene. So we race off to Strawberry to save Micah. I pull the bars off his cell and we escape through the town, leaving a path of destruction in our wake. Micah was the one who came up with the idea for the ferry raid back in Blackwater that got our gang in trouble at the beginning of the game, so he decides to lay low for a while before returning to the gang. In the meantime, I stay busy getting money to fix up the camp. Leopold Strauss has been working a loan shark scam and he needs me to help him get the money from the poor people he's suckered into borrowing from him. In real life, in the late 19th century, interest rates in the US were declining. Loaning money through government bonds and large institutions was less profitable than in earlier decades, so some greedy lenders became loan sharks. These guys would charge extremely high interest rates and use blackmail to shame their debtors into paying. Being in debt was stigmatized in this period, and many companies would fire their employees if they found out they were in debt. Loan sharks knew this and used social pressure to get their debtors to pay. Threats of violence like we see in Red Dead 2 were much less common, really only becoming more frequent with the rise of criminal gangs in the 1920s and 30s. Back to the game, one of the debtors is a Mr. Robel, an immigrant from Poland. I barge into his home and start asking for money, but he can only reply in Polish. I feel bad for the poor guy as I ransack his house, taking his only valuable possessions. Since he's from Poland, let's talk about immigration in the 19th century. As the Industrial Revolution transformed the United States from an agrarian society to the largest economy in the world, people around the world saw the US as a land of opportunity, a place to escape the troubles of their home countries and to build a better future. In the early 19th century, this American dream was realized by immigrants from mostly northwestern Europe. Many of these immigrants already spoke English, and most were Protestant Christians, so they had an easier time assimilating to American society. But in the 1840s, the terrible Irish potato famines led to the first large-scale Catholic immigration to the US, resulting in anti-immigrant sentiment known as nativism. In the 1850s, the Know Nothing Party made waves in American politics, with their biggest success being winning the 1854 gubernatorial race in Massachusetts. The Know Nothings believed in restricting immigration, excluding foreign-born people from holding office, and requiring a minimum age of 21 to become a citizen. At first, the party was secretive, and they got their name from the response people would give if asked about the organization: "I know nothing." But the outbreak of the Civil War saw their popularity decline as the nation fought for survival and immigration decreased. After the war, however, nativism made a comeback. The Know Nothing Party was dead, but now the US was seeing large numbers of Chinese immigrants coming to work on the railroads or in the gold mines of California. America's first Chinatown was built in San Francisco, and as I mentioned in the previous episode, the local and state governments there were often hostile to the Chinese. By 1880, there were over 100,000 Chinese Americans, and in 1882, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, banning immigration from China. In addition to increased immigration from China, the late 19th century saw an increase in immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe. As tensions in Europe increased in the decades before World War I, many people sought refuge in the US. Jews from Eastern Europe fled the violence of pogroms in Tsarist Russia. Political deviants like anarchists and socialists sought safety in the US as European rulers cracked down on protests, trying to protect their monarchies. More than 70% of these new immigrants passed through the port of Ellis Island near New York City. The Statue of Liberty was also built in France during this time and gifted to the US in the mid-1880s. In October 1886, the statue was assembled on Bedloe's Island, inscribed on its base with these famous words from Emma Lazarus's poem, The New Colossus: "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free." The Statue of Liberty became a symbol of the American dream, and immigrants continued flocking to the US for a better life. Once they arrived, however, they quickly realized that life as an immigrant was difficult. Most found work in the factories, living in absolutely appalling conditions. Tenement houses were built for factory workers to live in, but in the era before building codes, these tenements lacked air circulation, windows, and sufficient lighting. Journalist and social activist Jacob Riis, who himself was an immigrant from Denmark, brought national attention to the terrible housing conditions in America's slums in his book How the Other Half Lives, published in 1890. The hall is dark, and you might stumble over the children pitching pennies back there. Not that it would hurt them. Kicks and cuffs are their daily diet. Here where the hall turns and dives into utter darkness is a step, and another, a flight of stairs. You can feel your way if you cannot see it. Listen, that short hacking cough, that tiny helpless wail, what do they mean? The child is dying with measles. With half a chance it might have lived, but it had none. The dark bedroom killed it. The first building codes in the US were passed around the time of Red Dead 2's setting. For example, in 1901, New York City passed the New Law Tenement Act, which required all resident housing to have windows. Reform movements like Jane Addams' Hull House provided assistance to immigrants in finding housing and work, but life for most immigrants was still difficult. Those who wanted to escape the harsh realities of city life in the late 19th century could try their luck in building a homestead out in the West, but as we see in the game, this was easier said than done. Buying land, farm tools, seeds, and other necessities often put homesteaders into debt, and if their crops didn't yield what they hoped, they'd be stuck in a cycle of poverty or forced to take loans from less reputable sources like Herr Strauss. As I continue on my journey gathering debts from Strauss's victims, I come across this well-dressed woman digging in the dirt. This is Deborah McGinnis, an amateur paleontologist studying dinosaurs. She appears to be based off the real-life Mary Anning, an English paleontologist from the early 19th century who played a major role in changing our understanding of Earth's history. The first dinosaur fossil was discovered in England way back in 1677 by Dr. Robert Plot, but Dr. Plot concluded that the fossil was from a large war elephant or from an ancient giant human as described in the Bible. By the late 18th century, fossil collecting had become popular among tourists in Lyme Regis, a coastal English town with remarkable sedimentary rock formations. Mary Anning's father often took her and her brother to the area to hunt for fossils as a kid. Now, as a woman in 19th century England, Mary Anning was excluded from the Geological Society of London, despite the fact that she knew more about the fossils she collected than did the people who purchased her collection. Famous paleontologists like William Buckland, who wrote the first full description of a dinosaur fossil, would travel to Lyme Regis to meet with Mary and get her advice and opinions, but they didn't even include her name in their research publications. In Red Dead 2, Deborah McGinnis is frustrated that people laugh at her and her theories. She wants to prove them all wrong, and she needs our help. Her competition with other paleontologists could be inspired by the bone wars of the late 19th century. Othniel Charles Marsh and Edward Drinker Cope were two prominent paleontologists who used their wealth and influence to fund massive fossil hunting expeditions in Colorado, Nebraska, and Wyoming. Both men used any means necessary to discredit the other, from slander to theft and even destroying fossils. If McGinnis is participating in the bone wars, her paranoia makes a lot more sense here. All across Red Dead 2's map you can find dinosaur fossils to send to McGinnis in exchange for money. It's a simple open-world collectible side quest, but I love the connection to real history. It's these little touches that make Red Dead 2 so fun for me. For now, Arthur and the gang are busy making money and rebuilding their lives. Today we explored some of the realities of American life in 1899, from food, drugs, and alcohol to Jim Crow, immigration, and even paleontology. Next time we'll talk about outlaws, religious cults, famous industrialists, and more. So if you'd like to see more, make sure to subscribe to the channel for the next episode of History Teacher Explains Red Dead Redemption 2. Peace out for now.